Change management is often referred to as the soft stuff. And that makes sense because, you know, it's not as techy as the IT solutions that we're talking about needing to come up with for some of the processes here. However, what's important to remember is some recent research that shows over 70% of organizational change efforts fail. Okay, if you go into a change effort without the willingness to put in the sweat equity and the resources, you do so with considerable peril. So why is a reasonable question to ask, and it's awful easy to point at people and say, we got folks who are stuck in their ways, not open-minded, not willing to address new ways of doing business. And the concern, I don't know if anybody's played the beer game from MIT, John Sternman. Has anybody played it? It's not the beer game that we all learned in high school and college. It's a little different. But what the takeaway from this simulation is this: systems drive behaviors which drive results. So we can focus on people and say behave differently, but if we don't focus on the system that we're working in, we're not going to make changes. We're not, as much as we would like to just tell people go out and do it, we are not going to be successful that way. Now, in the summary worksheets that y'all have in your packets, we've got a couple questions about organization change management. I'm going to talk about a roadmap that we put together over the last couple months to try to create that system to make it easier for people to provide supports for people to make the changes that we're going to ask them to make in their behaviors. So keep in mind those first two questions around organizational change management. The first one says, is the roadmap you're proposing, is that going to be sufficient? Are there pieces missing there? And the second question asks, are you unique? Does this roadmap not fit you for some reason or other? And so take some notes as you watch the roadmap that we're proposing here, and ask the question, will this work for us? So I've got a list of folks who helped, and I apologize if I've left anybody off the list. We had a lot of great insight and input and a lot of hard work into putting the roadmap together that we put together. Without their insight, this roadmap wouldn't have come together. We were charged with developing a repeatable roadmap. So in other words, something that is going to apply across a lot of different organizations. And the backbone or the framework we're using to do this work is the Human Services 2.0 change drivers that we heard Daniel talking about earlier today. So there's 10 drivers out there that speak to workflow, how we do our work, and if we put those things in place, we have a lot better chance of achieving interoperability, of making interoperability work. And the last bullet on there around purpose says not only do we got to worry about infrastructure and how we do our work, but in addition, we need to worry about mindset. Are people accepting and embracing the idea of these changes that we're asking people to make? So what I'd like to do is to give you a little bit of mindset of the assumptions that we tried to build this roadmap under. Change is a journey, right? So we're going down a road. What I'd like to tell you is I've got a roadmap so we know exactly where we're going. But I think, in fact, this picture probably says a little better what change is going to be like. We're going to go around a bend and not know be positive of what to expect. All right, and our group kind of had that mindset. We didn't kind of have it. We had that mindset when we built the roadmap that I'm about to show you. Now, this is before the floods in Colorado, but it was still kind of a dark and dreary and scary kind of a day. And when you go around the bend, who knows what you're going to find? This is a real place in southern Colorado, and sometimes coming to that point of no return is a bad thing. Sometimes it's a good thing, but it's always kind of a scary thing. So what we're going to show you is the roadmap we're proposing you follow. So you'll be affected by this. And I want to show you some examples of how I'd expect this roadmap to play out, and I want you to take good notes for why this will work for you or why you don't think it'll work for you. Here it is, 4 steps. Step 1 says, do a stakeholder analysis. Think through all the folks who are going to be affected and impacted by the changes that we're proposing to make. Communicate, communicate, communicate. That was very clear in the first symposia that we had. A lot of folks said, you know, you can't over-communicate. Put the word out there with what we have to do. Then we've got to figure out a way to identify risks in the changes we're trying to make and mitigate those risks. And finally, our suggestion to you is to build a scorecard. Paul just talked about it. Are you measuring? Have you figured out what success looks like? Do we have a way of tracking what we're doing? All right, so there's the roadmap. And as I go into each one of these steps separately, I want to show you some examples of how it's going to play out. So in the stakeholder analysis, step one of this is going to be figuring out who the stakeholders are. And there's going to be some influential people, and it would be easy to say, for stakeholders, all we need is an org chart, and we'll just pull the top tier of the org chart off and say, those are the folks we got to worry about and convince this is a good idea. And I think that's probably short-sighted. No doubt all of us are stakeholders in this process, right? And there are going to be some informal leaders who are very influential in the ability to communicate why this is important and why it's going to be successful. So we got to figure out who those folks are going to be. And then in step two, we need to assess their stance toward interoperability. And we're proposing kind of a rigorous process here to do that. So if Richard is the stakeholder I'm worried about, I'm going to ask 4 questions about him. How much power does he have? How interested is he in this initiative? What's his attitude for it? Is he for it or against it? And then the last piece here is around how active is he going to be in this whole process? And then once we've got a sense of those 4 dimensions of how Richard feels towards interoperability, we can draw a couple graphs, right? The first one shows power versus interest. So if Richard, we all know Richard's very influential and very powerful guy. You can tell it just when he stands up here. And if he's feeling pretty negative, has very little interest, he's going to end up in the upper left-hand corner of that top chart. So we're going to need to do something to move him over to the other side, because with his help, we can make a difference, right? If Richard has a very positive attitude and he's low in activity right now, we got to come up with some ways to get him more active so we can get him up there in that supportive corner of the chart. So it's a way to think about people. There's no answers with what to do to people, but once we see where they lie in these 4 dimensions, we can come up with some strategies to try to get him on board and include him. All right? The last piece of the stakeholder analysis is to identify and cultivate champions. And so we spent some time asking the question, what should champions look like? And here's some answers. They're real close to Jesus, I guess. Yeah, these guys can walk on water. They can do whatever you want them to do. So that would be good. You got to get them. And then what do we want these guys to do for us? Well, first of all, we want them to market interoperability. I want to be excited when I listen to Richard talk about what this stuff looks like. And I want them to identify other potential folks who could support the effort. I'm asking them to communicate what's going on in this whole process of trying to achieve interoperability. And I want them to solve problems for us that we might bump into that they can help resolve some of the people things. Now, I have no doubt there are some great champions, great individuals in here, great candidates to be champions. And if I were in your shoes, I would be asking the question, how much time is this champion stuff going to take me? One of the questions that's out there, you need to identify how much time is this going to take? What kind of resources? Do you want to resource an individual for that role specifically so that you can carve out time for them? That's an issue to be determined. I will tell you, in change initiatives I've been involved in, a champion is a key resource. So I would encourage you to figure out how you're going to carve out time for those folks. Then, so that's step 1, the stakeholder analysis, right? Step 2 is around communications. So we're going to gather inputs from 2 symposia, right? And from all the work we did in between last May and now. And we're going to have a sense of what's going to end up being important. So we cannot over-communicate. So this define and execute a communication plan is all about finding what are those key messages and who needs to get them. All right, so we need to spend some time brainstorming, thinking about who needs to know what, and be real deliberate about making those communications. So this is the cause and effect fishbone diagram. Kairo Ishikawa invented it. If you haven't done one in the past, let's go to the happy hour later. We'll do one together. They're really fun. But it's a way of trying to come up with all the things that we need to make sure we're communicating to folks as we go out. And I've got some major categories here that speak to an organizational mindset. People need to believe, for example, that we've got the wherewithal to achieve interoperability. If they don't have that, it's going to be hard to create a mindset for people to accept the kinds of changes. So there's some organized ways to think about what those messages need to be that we need to communicate. And then we got to ask the question, what's the best way to communicate it? So this graph suggests some of those messages are going to be very benign, not very emotional, and not very complex. Great, send a mass email out, we're good to go. I'll bet you there's some messages we need to communicate that will be very emotional, maybe in fact impact reward and recognition structures, maybe very complicated. If that's the fact, don't send out a mass email. We may need to sit down with some face-to-face. So as we evaluate those kind of dimensions, that'll help us figure out what is the vehicle we're going to use to communicate whatever those key messages are. And that's all grand stuff if we deliver, all right? So once we've captured, here's what needs to be communicated, here's the vehicle we're going to do it, we got to figure out who the audience is for each one of those messages and who's going to deliver it, and then hang a due date on this matrix. Without execution, that stuff, it's worthless. So we need to make sure we deliver on all the communications. Step 1, do a stakeholder analysis. Step 2, put a communication plan in place. Step 3, identify risks and develop risk mitigation strategies. So we're going to have a lot of data already that we've talked about. These are things that we should really spend some time thinking about, or it could come back to bite us. In addition, we want to use a survey from the Human Services 2.0 change drivers. So we're going to go off and collect some data from the appropriate folks to answer the question, how do you feel about each one of those drivers? Now, this is a quiz. Somebody shout out one of the drivers that Daniel talked about earlier today.
Confidentiality.
Thank you very much. Good one. Give me another one. Workforce development, right? Good. And there's 10 of those that the collective experience of a lot of people all around the country have come together and said these things need to be in place. So we're going to ask the question, are those things in place? And then we're going to go off and measure it with something that looks like this. So this graph looks at the 10 drivers, and it says which of those is going to be the hardest for your organization. All right, so again, we want this to be malleable for whatever organization is looking at it. And this might suggest customer focus, client focus is going to be really difficult to us for whatever circumstances. All right, if that's the case for that organization, now we got to answer the question, what are we going to do about that? So I'm going to show one tool, and this is a force field analysis, as a way to kind of think about what do we do for that. So what we're going to do is evaluate both things that inhibit customer focus and things that drive customer focus. And after this analysis, we can take a hard look and see if there are some things we can put in place, supports we can put in place for the organization to help them. Now, this is one example of a tool, and there's a lot of different tools. Kerry Hoff's favorite tool is failure modes and effects analysis. So we'll use whatever's appropriate in a way to try to find what are the right supports we can put in place for people going forward. So we're going to collect some data and then figure out, we're going to let that data tell us a story for where we need to focus our energies to make this thing work. All right. Step 1, stakeholder analysis. Communication strategy, identify risk, build risk mitigation strategies, and the last step in this scorecard is to build, not in the scorecard, in the presentation, is to build a scorecard, all right? And we want to think about 2 kinds of metrics to put into the scorecard, leading and lagging indicators. Leading indicators are going to look at the activities we're involved with today that we think are going to be necessary to make change happen, all right? So, for example, communication strategies. right? Have we done the communications that we signed up to do? That would be an example of a leading indicator, something we can measure right now that promises results in the future. Lagging indicators are going to be things we can measure to say we made a difference with this initiative, right? How do our clients view us today versus how they viewed us in the past? Now, we've made a proposal. We've come up with several metrics that are out there, but I think this is a very personal thing to have Rick tell you, this is what you ought to measure. If Rick told Rick that, he'd choke on it, all right? So these are good metrics, and I think they could work well, but you need to buy into it. So just like the champion going to be requiring some resources, this is going to require resources in a couple ways. First of all, to go off and figure out how to collect the data. And if you don't collect it and measure it and feedback on a regular basis, the metrics aren't going to do you any good. So you need to make this scorecard hold your group accountable to, are you making progress? Is it giving us what we want to do? So here's an example. Over time, we've got X number of communications that we want to have happen. If this example were real, we would be nervous because it says we're not getting the things done we said we were going to get done. So 3 pages of recommendations. Out of the chute, figure out who those stakeholders are and ask the question, how do they feel about interoperability? Cultivate champions. Find out who those folks are and then figure out how you're going to resource their time. All right? And the third one is to initiate development of the personas. I believe those personas will change things dramatically from a dry IT problem to a very rich, we've got a people concern here that we can figure out a way to address. So those personas need to be real and pervasive and in front of everybody. So we're thinking about not just some sterile IT thing, but instead the work we do and how we serve the clients that we have. So that's right out of the chute. Midterm, put a communication strategy together. That matrix that we had, here's the message, here's the audience, here's the vehicle, by when, put that together and execute it. Adopt and track performance metrics. That means it's a part of your monthly, weekly review, not annual review, but you're doing it periodically and it's in front of you all the time. Identify and prioritize behavior changes needed. Remember that was that force field analysis we looked at? We're going to ask people to do things differently. What are those things we're asking them to do different? And are we putting the right supports in place to help people make that shift? And then we need to step back, not just look at behaviors, but ask a question about the infrastructure. Are our hiring practices supporting the changes we're trying to make? Are our reward and recognition practices? Are our training practices? All the things organizationally, we need to take a step back and look at those and make sure they support what we're trying to do and not get in the way of them. And long term, keep the scorecard in front of you. Is it achieved what you're trying to achieve? The persona exercise, as I understand it, is not a one-shot deal, but that will continue to evolve and get rich as you learn things. And, you know, Daniel talked about creating Facebook pages for these folks. I think there's a lot we can do there to make that a really rich source of motivation and vision for what we're trying to do. And then finally, you're never done understanding the organizational infrastructure. Do you have the right pieces in place to support what you're trying to do?